Welcome to the Cuteness Report!
To make our Hello Kitty clutch, we'll be using 17.5 by 12 inches of Hello Kitty fabric, 17.5 by 12 inches of black fabric, and for the bow we'll be using 2 pieces of 8 by 5 inches of red fabric. For the little strap it measures 4 by 2 inches. For the center of the bow we have a fabric covered button, and to make our bow fluffy we'll be using polyfill. And for our closure we have these little snap buttons. We'll also be using 34 3/4 by 12 inches of fusible interfacing. To begin, we're going to take our black fabric and align it up with our Hello Kitty fabric with the wrong side facing up. We're going to align the corners to make sure that they are perfectly square with one another. Once we have all that done, we're going to sew a seam on the left-hand side. Once we have the seam sewn on the left-hand side, we're going to open up the fabric. When we open up the fabric, we should see the wrong side of the Hello Kitty fabric facing us and the seam popping up towards us. Now we're going to take our interfacing and we're going to place it right over our fabric, aligning it with the sides and the corners of the fabric. Be sure that the shiny side is facing towards the fabric. Then we're just going to iron the interfacing on top. Once the interfacing is attached to the fabric, we're ready to make our measurements and markings. We're going to start by folding our fabric in half right on the seam that we just created. Just take the fabric from one side and fold it onto the other and just press the seam so that we can see the crease on the other side. When we open up our fabric, we should see that crease in the middle that we just made. Now we're going to take a ruler and a marker and mark right on top of that crease so that it's visible. The crease that we just made is actually the top of the bag. Now we're going to measure from the top of the bag to the bottom of the bag, which is 5 inches. We're going to take that measurement and place it onto our fabric. The next area we're going to measure is the bottom of the bag. Here you can see that there's a crease in the middle. The entire bottom of the bag is 2 inches. When we mark it onto our fabric, we're not going to just mark 2 inches. We're going to mark it in 1-inch increments so that we can indicate that crease that we saw in the middle. So there's 1 inch and then there's 2 inch. Then we're just going to draw a straight line down on both of the inches. Next, we're going to measure the back of the bag. The back of the bag should measure 5 inches just like the front of the bag if we want the top of our bag to be flat and symmetrical. So as you can see, it's 5 inches, and we're just going to mark this onto our fabric. Now what's left is the flap. On here the flap measures about 4.5 inches, and then what's left of our fabric measures around 5 inches, and after we sew it it'll probably be 4.5 inches due to the seam allowance. And just for reference, we're going to measure all of our markings. We're going to start with the top. From the top to the front of the bag, that one, it measured 5 inches. So we're just going to mark this as the front with the measurement of 5 inches. Next, we measure the bottom of the bag, which as a total measured 2 inches. So we had our 1 inch, then the crease, and then 2 inches. So we're just going to mark it the bottom, and that the total was 2 inches. Next, we measured the back of the bag, which was the same as the front, which measured again 5 inches. Then what was left was the flap of the bag, which also measured 5 inches. The reason why we made all of these markings on the back of our fabric is so that we know where we're going to have to make the creases. Also, we're going to make these same markings on the other side, which is the inside of our bag, and this will be the mirror image. So again, we're just going to start with the top of the bag, measure the front, which is 5 inches, then we'll measure the bottom, which is a total of 2 inches in 1 inch increments, and then after that we had the back, which also measured 5 inches, and then finally what was left was the flap, which measured 5 inches. Now we're going to crease the bottom area, and in total we should have 3 creases. We also made the 3 creases on the Hello Kitty side. Now we're going to take the creased area and fold them into what looks like the letter M. Once we have our letter M, we're going to fold down the top seam, and then we're going to pair it up with our inside area, which is the black fabric, and make that into a letter M. So we have the 2 letter M's paired up, and now we're just going to clip them all together. We're going to clip the other side as well. Once everything is clipped together, it should look like this. All of the corners and sides should line up as well. Now we're ready to sew our seam. But before we do that, if you want a rounded corner on your flap, now's the time to make that. Here we're going to use a CD, but if you don't have a CD, you can use a plate as well to make the rounded corner. We're just going to line up the edge of the CD with the edge of the flap, and then use our marker to make that shape. Then we're just going to cut them out. And now we can see what our bag will look like. We have our flap and the body of our bag. Now we're just going to sew a seam right around our bag up to the top, but leaving a section open so that we can flip our bag inside out. Now we're back, and as you can see, we have sewn the seam up to the top on both sides of the bag, and we still have that opening so that we can flip our bag out. But before we do that, we're going to make little cuts on the corner so that it's easier to flip out. When we make the cuts around the corner, it's very important to not hit that seam. If the seam is cut, it could cause a hole to be on the corner of the bag. It's not necessary to do this, and you can skip it if you want to. We're going to continue the same cuts on the other corner of the bag. Now we're ready to flip over our bag. We're just going to stick our hand into the opening and push the bottom of the bag into our hand. Hopefully we can grab that bottom. And once we grab the bottom of the bag, we're just going to pull it out through that opening. It's going to kind of look like a ball, but just keep pushing it out. And once the bag is pushed out, you can start to shape it. The hardest part of pushing out the bag is pushing out the pleats that form the bottom of the bag. Once they are pushed out, they should look like a triangle. So on the bottom, you should have 2 triangles, one on each side. If you're having difficulties making the triangles symmetrical with one another, you can push it back in and then push it back out again to see if the triangle will come out to the shape that you want so that it matches the other side. It's important that they match because you want to have a flat bottom, otherwise the whole bag may turn out to be a little lopsided. Once the corners are pushed out and match each other, we're ready to work on the flap. Just place your finger into the curve of the flat and push it out. Once the corners are done, we're ready to close that top of the bag. We're just going to fold the fabric along the original seam line on the top and the bottom of that opening so that they are matching together. Once they are matched together, we're ready to sew that seam. We're going to make a stitch on the outside of that flap to sew that seam together. We're back with our bag, and as you can see, we have that top stitch around the top of our flap. Now we're ready to add in our snap so that we can open and close our bag. We're going to take a ruler and get the measurements of the flap of the bag. It looks like it measures around 11.5. So the center would be at 5 3/4. So at that point, we're going to mark the bag and place the top of the snap onto that area. I also like to mark the bottom of the snap so I know exactly where I should sew it onto the bag. After I've sewn the top of the snap onto the flap, I'm going to take a marker and mark that little part of the snap that sticks out. Then I'm going to take the flap and fold it over onto the body of the bag and press it so that an imprint of that top of the snap is made onto the bag. This impression will let me know where I should be placing the bottom portion of the snap. I'll line up the center of the bottom snap to that impression, and then I'm just going to make a marking on the top of the snap so I know exactly where I should be sewing it in. I've sewed on the bottom of the snap button, and we'll just check how it closes. It's nice and centered, so we're ready to work on the bow. For the bow, we'll be using the two 8x5 fabrics and our 4x2 strip. We're going to start by rounding the corners of our rectangular fabric. This is because Hello Kitty's bow that's on the fabric is rounded as well. So we're just going to mark the edges using the CD to get that curve. Once we're finished marking the fabric, we're just going to cut it. We've cut the corners on the fabric and now we're ready to sew. We're going to sew the seam around the bow, but we're not going to sew it all the way. We're going to leave a section on top so that we have an opening to where we can flip the bow over. For the strip of fabric, we're just going to fold it in half, and then we're going to sew a seam in the shape of an L. This will give us a closed bottom and a top opening to where we can flip the strip over. We finished sewing the seam on our fabric that will make our bow, and now we're ready to flip it out. We're just going to open the top. If you want to, you could make the opening a little bit bigger, and then we're just going to push the fabric out from that hole. Once the bow is turned over, just make sure that the edges of the bow are pushed out. Otherwise, it may look a little square on the edges of the curve. For the strip, we're going to turn it out by using a pencil. Sometimes it's difficult to get the start with the pencil, so I'll use a seam ripper because it has a pointed edge that could catch the fabric. Once it's started, I'm just going to finish pushing it out with the pencil. Then I'm going to cut the sewn end off so that I could move the seam to the bottom so that the top is smooth. Next, we're going to fluff up our bow by stuffing in the polyfill. I'm just going to continue stuffing the bow until it's somewhat firm so that I could still shape it. Once it's filled to my liking, I'm going to close the opening by hand stitching a seam. Once we have closed the bow, we're ready to shape it. I'm going to use a pen to make the middle shape of the bow. Once I have the shape that I want, I'm going to take that strip, which is our strap, and I'm going to place it on top of the bow. Then I'm going to bring it around the bow until the ends of the strap meet together. I'm going to pinch the ends together until there is enough fabric so that I could sew them together by hand. I'm going to grab a needle and thread and stitch it across from one end to the other. Once we're done stitching the strap on, we're going to remove our pen and fluff up the bow. Now we're going to take the fabric covered button and sew it right into the middle of the bow. Once our button is sewed onto the bow, we're ready to place it on top of our clutch. I decided to place it on the right hand side of the clutch, and now I'm just going to sew it on. And now we're finished with our Hello Kitty clutch with the big red bow. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe.